Well, first, let me say I want to thank the IKPK and Ralph for being here. It is a wonderful honor to be able to experience your really lovely city, and to also do so during our own very interesting presidential election in the United States. And to be having so many different conversations about that, it gives me a wonderfully different perspective on my own politics in my home country. I will say, too, that if I misspeak, it's because I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning watching our our debate last night. It was quite early in the morning, and it's been quite fun and interesting, to say the least. So what I want to do today is talk in a nutshell about my recently published book, Prototype Politics, and sort of lay out some of the really big themes, and hopefully in a way that will sort of spark us to have a good conversation afterwards in the Q&A. But I want to talk about how and why campaigning is newly what I call technology intensive, how that has impacted electoral politics and shaped the communication strategies of campaigns, and then really sort of apply the lens of the book, which runs through the 2014 midterm cycle, to what we're seeing now during the presidential race in the United States, because I figured that would be nice and current, and hopefully some of the arguments and ideas and concepts that I develop will give us an interesting lens on sort of what we're seeing take shape now. So I want to do three things today in the context of this talk on the U.S. Electoral political context. First, I'm going to introduce just this idea of technology-intensive campaigning and why it provides a really good framework for understanding how and why politics is changing and the implications of that. Second, I'm going to focus on the new sorts of political practitioners that we see who work in politics, not only working with technology, but also working with data and analytics. And I want to tell a story here about how we've seen over the last decade electoral politics in the areas of technology and digital media and data and analytics get more specialized, bring in people who have much more fluid careers than in the past, and how now that entrepreneurship, specifically the founding of political consultancies, are a newly important aspect of this technology-intensive campaigning. And finally, as I mentioned, I'll sort of pull back and show how we could see these dynamics at work during the 2016 cycle. Okay. First, as a way to start with technology-intensive campaigning, I love starting with this quote. This is a quote from Michael Slaby, who was the Chief Technology Officer for Obama 2008 and the Chief Integration and Innovation Officer for Obama 2012. And what it really captures is that in the 4 years in between when Barack Obama first got elected to when they were gearing up to run his re-election campaign, the world had fundamentally changed. As Slaby puts it, the world moves on us, right? So the original campaign in 2008, although from afar looked like this really amazing social media and technology sophisticated effort, really wasn't that if you actually were on the campaign itself. Technologies didn't always work. Things had to be fit together. They were building a plane while they were actually running, where they were trying to fly it, right? Which is sort of the metaphor campaign staffers often gave me about that time. They were developing new technologies in the course of running an electoral effort. At the same time, the world had changed fundamentally in terms of the technologies and the tools and the sorts of applications that have come to dominate the landscape today. And just one example of those changes is Twitter. In 2008, Twitter was just a little blip in the social media landscape, right? And in fact, I remember in 2012, I was sort of searching through the footnotes of my first book, which was published in 2012, but stopped in 2008. And I was like, where is Twitter? I don't even remember the role that Twitter played in the Obama campaign in 2008. I had a footnote in there run by the digital director of the Obama campaign saying that in 2008 they just had an intern in a basement somewhere man the Twitter account. And indeed, if you actually look back at 2008, Obama's victory tweet was retweeted 157 times in 2008. 157 times. Very few, right? Fast forward 4 years to 2012, and the Obama campaign's victory tweet at the time became the most sort of retweeted tweet ever, with more than 800,000 retweets in less than 3 days. So in 4 short years, a monumental shift in terms of using this new social media platform and its importance, particularly for shaping the narratives of the professional press. But broadly, we could see just this shift with Twitter becoming newly important in between election cycles as a broader story about things like increasing audience fragmentation across hundreds of different platforms now. So that politics from election cycle to election cycle looks very different than it did in the past. And indeed, our politics today looks far different than politics of 50 and 60 years ago. In the 1960s, you could reach 80% of the electorate just by running an ad on the big 3 networks during prime time, right? Today, to reach anywhere near 80% of the electorate would require media buys across hundreds of different platforms. Not only television, but also social media, etc. So in this world, campaigns face 2 big challenges. The first is, how do they develop the technological expertise and talent in order to sort of keep pace with these continual changes at the application layer of the internet? So we're going to talk a little bit more about Snapchat in a minute, but you saw Scott Goodstein, right, talking yesterday about this entirely new thing that didn't exist 4 years ago that all of a sudden is a key way to reach millennials. At the same time, campaigns need to figure out particularly how to use data in order to reach the voters they need to reach for a competitive electoral gain. As a result of these 2 challenges, technologies now form the basis of everything that a modern presidential campaign does. This is the technology and data infrastructure for the Obama 2012 campaign. And really what it reveals is that data underlies everything that campaigns do, from campaign advertising on television to targeting voters on Facebook. And let me just say a little bit more about how all of this works as a way to sort of set this up. So in this bottom corner here, you see the Democratic Party's voter file. The Democratic Party maintains a voter file of over 800 points of data on every single member of the U.S. electorate. All right. This includes lots of public information, which is the most important. Things like party registration, things like turnout history. So if somebody has voted in a primary, that data is stored in the Democratic Party's voter file. But that also includes things like consumer data. So people who might sign up for a club card at a grocery store or a drugstore, for instance, that consumer data makes its way into political databases in the United States. And we have very different data laws. But in the U.S., this is the context where both parties maintain massive voter files on every single member of the electorate. It also includes, really importantly, things like historical IDs. So you're going to hear a lot about canvassing later on today. One of the things that American campaigns invest a lot in is going door to door, knocking on the doors of voters and saying, are you planning on voting in this election? Are you registered? Who might you be supporting? What sorts of issues really matter to you? And what parties do is they maintain this historical record of all these conversations with voters over time that carries forward across election cycles. So they could go back in time and say, here's Daniel Kreiss, this North Carolina voter. He turned out in the last couple primaries, and we know we knocked on his door in 2010 and 2012, and here's what he said. So what sorts of messages can we sort of use in order to pull him out to vote or try to persuade him for to come to join our candidate? What happens is campaigns sort of take this massive raw data file and they try to make it meaningful around here, which is analytics. And this is a really big new aspect of American presidential campaigning. Gets its start really around 2008, made much more sophisticated in 2012, and now further on down the line in 2016. But basically what campaigns need to do is take those 800 points of data on every member of the electorate and figure out, how do we make it meaningful? So they look for lots of patterns in the data, and they look broadly for a couple things. First of all, which voters are likely to be supporting my candidate, right? Because what you want to do is you want to make sure those folks get to the polls and turn out to vote. Secondarily, you want to make sure that they can give money to your campaign, and you want to make sure that you can try to sign them up to volunteer for your campaign. The second thing campaigns use this data to do is figure out who might be undecided and persuadable, right? So this is where they take this data and they look for patterns and they try to figure out, well, which voters seem to be leaning one way or another but haven't quite made up their minds. And then they try to figure out what issues matter most to them, right? What sorts of appeals can we use to move these undecided voters in one way or another? They also look for which voters are most likely to turn out. In a world of limited resources and a really big electorate, campaigns want to spend money as efficiently as possible. They want to get their voters to the polls and make sure they turn out on election day and essentially ignore their opponent's voters. That's the way the world works. The way that they do this is they take these 800 points of data on every member of the electorate. They constantly run surveys. I think somebody's going to talk about this a little bit later on today, but they run long-form surveys and they figure out who's supporting my person, who's likely to vote, who's open to persuasion on the basis of which sorts of appeals. And they score every member of the electorate on those bases and then try to develop their strategic communications around it. Okay? So how this works then is once you figure out who do we need to turn out, who do we need to persuade, this then runs into every other thing the campaigns do. And just to give you a few quick examples, up here we have our field campaigning. This is where those Obama canvassers back in 2012 went door to door with things like iPhones. They were given targeted lists of people who they either needed to turn out or they needed to persuade. There were scripts that they had in mind where they would make certain forms of appeals to their voters to try to turn them out to the polls or try to persuade them. It also drove television advertising. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but one of the key innovations of the 2012 Obama campaign was figuring out how to use cable set-top box information that cable companies basically collect on the people who are watching TV, to try to figure out ways to much more efficiently buy and target television advertising. So the Obama campaign used all the data they had. They created certain groups, and then they figured out what times of day and which channels are people most likely going to be watching TV, those people who we most need to either turn out or persuade, right? And then they bought television advertising in as efficient a way as possible as they could. And then finally, digital, which is way up there on top. This is what Scott Goodstein talked about a lot yesterday. But if campaigns run, let's say, Facebook advertising campaigns or promoted tweets on Twitter, what they want to do is, again, figure out what sorts of voters do we need to reach, what sorts of messages do we need to reach them with. And what's really important is that in this era of multiple platforms, changing technologies, and audience fragmentation, oftentimes the only way you can reach voters is through digital and social media. Okay? And just one quick example of that, when I sat down with the Obama 2012 folks, one of the things that they told me is that they only had phone numbers for 50% of young voters. All right, in the U.S., 18 to 24. But of those 50%, they could reach 85% of them on Facebook. So Facebook is now often supplanting older ways that campaigns had of reaching voters more broadly. Okay, in this world of technology and data-intensive campaigning, the broad question comes up is, how are campaigns and parties innovating? How are they finding the specialized skills and expertise that they need, right? And can we compare some parties doing it better than others? I think to most observers of the 2012 presidential election, it was pretty clear that the Democratic and Republican parties in the U.S. were not evenly matched when it came to technology, digital media, data, and analytics. And indeed, this is the GOP Growth and Opportunity Project report. This is a massive and sprawling, basically, election post-mortem after Mitt Romney lost, where the GOP basically took a step back and said, what do we need to do better? And it included all sorts of things, including broadening their demographic outreach, appealing to more people of color as well as women and bringing them into the party. But it also included long sections on technology, where in essence they talked about how Democrats had a clear edge on new media and field canvassing, right? Folks who are out there going door to door, and then digital media. How do we use digital technologies in order to appeal to and mobilize the electorate? So the Democrats did it better according to the Republican Party itself. So one question that I had in framing my book was not only how do campaigns use this stuff and what does it look like, but why do we see these differences? And can we learn something about how the Democrats have been successful that might apply to other campaigns in other contexts? And this is what I want to talk about now. Broadly, the ways that political practitioners are changing and the ways that we think of who practices politics are changing. And the first story that I want to tell in this context is about specialization and is about career fluidity, which is to say the increasing specialization of technology-related positions on campaigns and the ways that one of the really surprising things I found in my data is that careers in politics are far more fluid in the U.S. Than I imagined, specifically in the domain of politics. But let me start here. One of the things I first did in my book was to just look and say, well, if the GOP says that they're behind the Democrats, is that actually the case and is it true? And if it is, could we find differences between the two parties, such as investments and hiring, that would suggest that that is in fact the case? So what I did is I had my graduate students and I put together a large data set of every staffer who had worked in a Democratic or Republican primary or general election presidential campaign from 2004 to 2012. And what we did is we used Federal Election Commission and other records to build this data set of 629 staffers who inhabited these roles on campaigns. All right. And what was so interesting is that right off the bat, we found there was really big discrepancies with respect to investment in these areas on Democratic and Republican campaigns. And I'm going to break this out a little bit more in a minute. But broadly, over that time span that we talked about, from 2004 to 2012, Democrats hired 507 staffers in the areas of technology, digital media, data, and analytics. Compared to 123 Republicans. Only one staffer worked on both sides of the aisle that entire time, which is really interesting. It wouldn't have been the case in years prior to 2004. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. But the people who work in politics at the level of tech are now as sorted into Republican and Democrats as every other aspect of political practitioner and consultant life. But broadly, we found this massive difference in hiring between the two parties more generally. The other thing that we really looked for is, well, who are these people who work in tech and digital media and data and analytics? So what we did is we took that data set of 629 staffers, and my graduate students, bless their hearts, manually downloaded all their employment information from the social networking site LinkedIn on every single one of those staffers. And what we wanted to figure out was, what sorts of careers have they had over time? What do the people who actually work in this field look like when we look at the data? So that's what they did, and we ended up with this, which is really hard to see, but I will walk you through it, because there's two stories that we see here broadly in the data. The first is that campaigns over time have been hiring many more people in the areas of tech, digital, data, and analytics. And when I break those four things out, what I'm saying is that we looked for everybody in organizational records who had that in their title in some way, even though campaigns are differentially organized. But broadly, what we found is that there's been a massive shift. If you just sort of take the Democrats alone, from 34 staffers on the Kerry bid back in 2004 to 342 staffers on the Obama campaign in 2012. What these added bodies mean is increasing specialization. Scott told a little bit of this story last night, but what this means is that back in 2004, the same person was often responsible for updating the website, producing digital videos, sending out and testing emails, right? They were wearing multiple hats because there were so few people. By the time you jump to 2012, you see much greater specialization. So entire teams simply devoted to producing digital content for one social media platform like Twitter, all right, or Facebook. You see people just devoted to doing nothing but testing emails. Meanwhile, people devoted to doing nothing but writing emails, all right? Much greater specialization that over time means that within campaigns, People now have increasingly differentiated tasks that maps onto the many different roles that people who work in tech, digital data, and analytics can actually perform. And I think you saw this again with Scott, is that his role sort of morphs over time from somebody who's responsible for all the social media on the 2008 Barack Obama campaign to then, in 2012, you actually have teams that are devoted to each one of these different areas. All right? So, increasing specialization. The other thing we found, and this really blew us away because there's been a 40-year tradition in political communication research to suggest that politics is increasingly professionalized. This is not the case in the areas of technology, digital media, data, and analytics. Indeed, one of the really fascinating things we found about the Obama campaign is that only 21% of their staffers who worked in these areas had any previous campaign work whatsoever. Only 21% had previous campaign work. 21% had their primary work experiences actually in the political field. So these are the traditional folks who might work for an advocacy organization or they might work for a party organization and join a campaign. But what we found was massive amounts of people coming and being recruited into the Obama campaign from things like careers in the commercial technology sector, from places like in Silicon Valley or the tech sector in Chicago, from technology and digital and data and analytics firms, all right, broadly. So what this means is that on campaigns themselves, staffers are far more fluid in terms of their backgrounds than these career politicians or career practitioners that we often posited in the literature. Indeed, one of the central theses of my book is that campaigns actively try to deprofessionalize themselves precisely to keep pace in this innovative environment that I was talking about earlier. So they often look to pull in people from outside of politics to transfer knowledge, skills, different understandings about technology to presidential campaigns themselves. All right? And then the other thing we found is that, there's just a lot of staffers who it's their first experience work whatsoever. And indeed, there's a significant number of folks who are in their early 20s who had just never really worked another job before, who are now running social media accounts for major campaigns, right? And this is consistent. When we interviewed people in 2016 for a separate project who run Snapchat for primary bids, oftentimes we hear that it would be a body man or body woman traveling with a candidate who's actually producing social media that might be seen by hundreds of thousands of millennials, right? Often without layers of vetting. Okay, let me just give you an example of what this looks like. And again, it's that broad story of campaigns looking for knowledge and skills outside of politics themselves. This is Carol Davidson. I love Carol's example because she was one of the unsung heroes of the 2012 Obama campaign. She was the one who developed that innovative campaign set-top box advertising program I mentioned earlier. But she's a perfect example of someone who had mostly all of her work outside of politics prior to joining the Obama 2012 bid. This is just her LinkedIn profile. She basically comes out of working for telecommunications companies where she was figuring out how to do complex billing back in the days when every time you made a call on your cell phone, you'd be charged differently depending on where it went. But she was doing basically big data in the context of figuring out how to do the cell phone billings. She made a donation to the Obama campaign in 2008. When she did that, she included that she had this expertise in data and analytics. By the 2012 campaign, one of the things that they were looking to do when they were recruiting talent was figure out who can we bring on board that might have this specialized expertise. They found her in their database, they reached out to her, and she left the firm she was working for to go head up the media analytics group for the Obama 2012 bid. Okay? So again, it's that example of pulling in staffers from other places to help them stay innovative and to recruit the expertise that they need. All right. But it's not just these field crossers. Because if you had everyone coming from outside of politics, how do you know they'd be doing the sorts of work that politicians and politics sort of requires? And here's where I really turn in the book to recent literature on innovation in organizational sociology by David Stark and his colleagues. David Stark is a Columbia sociology professor. And what he finds in his studies of innovation in places like the video game industry and that we adapt for politics is that you not only need cognitive diversity, which is that story I told before, people coming from outside of politics, coming to work in politics for the first time, but you need also people with multiple overlapping ties that somehow keep everyone working together. And this is really Stark's argument. And I wanted to show two slides because what we did after the book was published, I've been working with a colleague on doing some more formal network analysis that looks at the differences between the Republican and Democratic parties when it comes in the context of what their networks actually look like. And one of the things that we really find is that on the Republican side of the aisle, there's less diversity of organizations that people work for. So again, remember this in the context of Carol Davidson, right? Where the Democrats are pulling in people from industry to work on their campaigns. Republicans have fewer organizations that are outside of politics more broadly, and they also have lots of more organizations and campaigns that are kind of disconnected or just connected by one person who might have ties to other people or other organizations. Whereas on the Democratic side of the aisle, you could see a much more robust and diverse network, but they're also held together by people who have multiple overlapping experiences working for the same campaign. And to illustrate this, here's one example. This is Michael Slaby, who was a vet of both the Obama 2008 and 2012 bids. Michael Slaby's story is precisely this idea of somebody who goes and works outside of politics to gain specialized knowledge and expertise, but then comes back periodically and works on different political campaigns where he creates relationships with other people in politics that somehow makes everything hold together. So, he worked for Obama for America in 2007, 2008, but then leaves in between the elections to go work for a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley in between elections. What does he do there? Well, he learns a lot about the tech industry. What are the new trends? What are the new things that are coming up? What sorts of things do we need to do when we think about rerunning the president's re-election campaign in 2012? And then he makes his way back onto the Obama campaign. In that context, he not only worked for different organizations, but he also has a set of relationships with other people who work in politics that holds everything together, that holds that diversity together in David Stark's terms. One other thing I want to talk about here before we get into 2016 is entrepreneurship. This also blew us away. So if sort of the story I've been telling earlier is that we see less professionalization than we might have expected in the context of politics. And broadly, what we see is working to pull people in from the outside, but also hiring people who've also worked in politics before to sort of keep innovation on track sort of within the political field. I also looked at entrepreneurship specifically in politics. So when we created that data set, we could also look at, well, what did these former presidential staffers then go on to do after these presidential campaigns? And what we found was significant amounts of innovation and entrepreneurship among these staffers. So on the Republican side of the aisle, we found that 14 different staffers founded 15 different firms and organizations from the 2004 election to after the 2012 election. Our data set here runs through about May 2014. But broadly, what these firms do is they house the innovations and the staffers from comparatively well-financed presidential runs, and they carry it across election cycles and down ballot, right? So one great example of this on the Republican side of the aisle are a set of firms that come out of Mitt Romney's bid in 2012, including Deeproot Analytics. This was co-founded by Alex Lundry, Romney's director of data science. One of the things that U.S. presidential campaigns make them unique is that they have lots of resources that they bring to the table. So what happens is that on those campaigns, those staffers who work for them, after the election is over, often found new ventures that house those innovations, those skills and ways of working. It keeps people in politics. And then they can carry them across election cycles and bring them down ballot. So Deeproot, for instance, works with a number of senatorial and gubernatorial campaigns and builds on the experience they had running for Romney. But even here, we also see another one of these big differences between the two parties. So 14 Republican staffers founded 15 different firms. In the U.S., on the Democratic side, we see 67 different firms founded by 65 different staffers. All right? Amazing amounts of entrepreneurship on the Democratic side of the aisle and founding of new organizations. And one of the ways that we think about why the Democrats have been more technologically advanced than the Republicans is this story right here. So people like Scott Goodstein, who's in our data set, his firm is in our data set, Revolution Messaging. People like Scott Goodstein work on a presidential campaign bid. They learn knowledge and they gain experience working for a presidential campaign bid. And then what they do is they then carry that knowledge and that experience to other bids. So you saw yesterday, Goodstein talked about his experience working on Obama 2008. This is his firm, which was founded after that campaign. If we carry this forward to 2016, they're doing the digital for Bernie Sanders. All right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Technologies and infrastructure, including the organizational infrastructures that parties have in politics, are built up over time. And if you want to look at sort of the origin point for all this, and I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A, but it was the Howard Dean campaign in 2004 that really sparked on the Democratic side of the aisle this massive period of the founding of new firms and organizations that could house Democratic talent, build up expertise, train people in how to do things like data and analytics, how to use digital technology successfully, how to engage in email fundraising, etc. And it was those folks who then founded a set of firms that have really played forward and have been key to every Democratic presidential campaign since. Just one example, you can look at Blue State Digital up there in the top right. It was a firm founded by Howard Dean, founded by 4 former alums of the Howard Dean campaign. What they did is they took the Dean technologies that Scott presented on earlier, and they made it their own. They received the IP in those technologies. They then brought that to the Democratic Party, and they then brought that to the Obama campaign in 2008. And it became MyBarackObama.com, that social networking platform that Scott talked about yesterday. It was that firm that did it. They also provide the back-end email client that is actually center and core of nearly every well-funded Democratic political campaign since, in terms of providing the analytics infrastructure for testing things like email, including on Obama Biden in 2012. So it's that core piece of technology. Okay. Let me jump now to the 2016 election cycle. I see I'm out about 30 minutes, which is what I was told to speak for. So I have about 10 more minutes, and then we could jump into the Q&A. So heading into the 2016 cycle, where had the things that I sketched out, sort of what do they look like, and how do they provide that deep context for the 2016 election broadly? Okay, first of all, one of the things that I found in doing my research is that the infrastructures of politics are pretty fragile. So this is an update of that earlier graph I showed of the tech and data infrastructure of the Obama bid. One of the things that happens after the election in 2012 is just that there's not a lot of resources available to maintain a lot of the tools and the technologies they built in-house. Right? So you can sort of see, and this comes from a presentation by one of the premier Democratic firms, NGP Van. But broadly, some of the very key, like their online electoral platform dashboard just doesn't survive. It's too expensive to keep people on staff. But in this world, all these new firms that get founded after 2012 emerge to basically pick up the slack. So this includes Civis Analytics, which was founded by the director of analytics on the Obama 2012 bid. It includes Blue Labs, a number of these folks who are now working for Hillary Clinton's bid broadly. But what happens is that entrepreneurship, those firms house a lot of the tech talent and tech skills from Obama 2012, and they now then carry it forward to new places. And this is important because, again, in the 2012 conversation, we see the same dynamic of new things entirely emerging, like Snapchat, right? So Scott talked about this briefly, but just one quick number to throw out there. Snapchat has more users than Twitter. Now, you guys aren't in a classroom, most of you aren't in a classroom on a regular basis with undergrads, but I can say from experience is that this is the one technology they all use. They all use it all the time. This is the central technology, a way to reaching 18 to 24-year-olds. And indeed, our most recent statistics is that 41% of 18 to 34-year-olds in the U.S. are on Snapchat currently. And of them, 2/3 are actual voters. So this is a way to reach sort of an engaged portion of the electorate. And again, firsthand experience, like Snapchat is where people go in order to, where young people go in order to consume and to produce political information much more broadly. An important struggle, and this is sort of the forefront of what we see on the Hillary Clinton side, is figuring out ways to meld multiple different forms of data sets together in order to create relational strategic communications. This also comes from an NGP Van, one of the Democratic firms I mentioned earlier, presentation recently. But broadly, campaigns have really struggled with how do we fit the multiple different streams of data we have together in order to figure out that the same person we're trying to knock on their door is that same person on Facebook that we need to reach, is the same person who's watching TV at that moment in time. The big forefront in electoral politics currently in 2016 is fitting multiple sources of data sets together to try to resolve the identity of a voter to speak to them in strategic ways. All right? Again, so you know that voter X lives at this address, is likely watching TV at this particular moment in time, is undecided in this voter file, is this profile on Facebook or this profile on Twitter. Trying to figure out how to relationally sort of get at those people and meld those different data sets together has sort of been the holy grail of campaigns over the last decade. But it's one of the things that firms, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, are sort of working very hard on. And just to give you another quick example of 2012 is that we see again this, of 2016, we see again the same pattern of people who have worked on previous Democratic presidential campaigns carrying their knowledge and skills forward. This is Matt Dover. He was on the Barack Obama presidential campaign in 2012. He becomes the director of campaigns in Civis Analytics, which is one of those firms that spin off from the Obama 2012 campaign and work now nationally for other candidates, and then becomes the voter analytics director for the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. So this idea that Democrats over time have invested and hired staffers onto their campaigns and that they've founded firms to house that knowledge and talent, and then they've made their way back to campaigns is one of those important stories. Okay. This is still in progress, but one of the things that we're doing is updating this big data set we have for the 2016 election. And again, we found significant differences in hiring between Republican and Democratic campaigns. So during the primaries, Bernie Sanders alone had a digital team of 43 staffers. And this is, again, technology, digital media, data, and analytics, so everyone with those things in the title, had about 43 people who were in their direct employ, and then including going out to firms like Scott's firm, Revolution Messaging, as well to supplement that. What's important with that hiring is that all those 43 staffers then go on and do other things. In fact, we interviewed the social media director of the Sanders campaign, Hector Segalia, and what is he doing now? He's heading up Bernie Sanders' independent effort that's trying to keep his supporters re-engaged in civic engagement. So again, taking the knowledge and skills people learn and playing it forward over time. Hillary Clinton has built a team of over 70 staffers in this area now, about 70 by our count, during the general election. Now compare this with Republican campaigns. 4 on Cruz, 3 on Rubio, 4 on Jeb, and 4 on Trump. Internal staffers. Now, one of the stories here is that Republican campaigns generally tend to hire outside consultancies instead of hiring in-person staff. It's a difference in strategy between the two sides. It's also a function of resources. Democratic campaigns, because they've built up a small donor base over time, do a much better job at candidate-directed fundraising as opposed to things like super PAC fundraising. That means they can much more flexibly spend their money and can build bigger campaign organizations that, again, over time pay dividends for political campaigns. And at least anecdotally, we haven't run the numbers yet, although we will be doing this, is that Hillary Clinton's staff looks a lot like following the Obama model. This was a Fast Company article that was published recently where they were talking about Clinton's team bringing in people from IBM and Etsy and Yelp, Gawker and Facebook and Kiva, etc. And less than half of, and this is according to the Fast Company article, less than half of the analytics team and almost none of the technology team had held a campaign position before, at least in early reporting. Now, we haven't done the numbers yet. We're waiting until after the cycle so we can fully evaluate the endpoint of the campaign. But broadly, it seems like, again, this story of looking outside of electoral politics, bringing in new knowledge and skills and talent is an important part of the 2016 campaign. And what do these people do? Well, they create innovative new political communication forms like Clinton's The Briefing. This is an in-house content marketing team that's really designed to produce strategic content that's not directly about selling Clinton or directly persuading, but broadly it's designed to be branded to be putting out things like fact checks and fact sheets, almost like an in-house reporting team for the Clinton campaign during 2016. And again, those staffers that Clinton is hiring are the ones who are behind things like that live fact check on Clinton's website during that first debate that attracted over 2 million page views during that hour when she was on stage with Trump during the first debate, which was 10 times more than their highest traffic at any other moment in time. So one of the things about bringing people inside is being able to produce these forms of very rich content that almost mimic in-house reporting teams. And this is something Scott also said yesterday, right? That with big digital teams, you could start to bring a lot of your content marketing in-house and be producing things that, in essence, start to try to replace traditional campaign journalism by producing rich content. I mean, just take a look at this. This is a professionalized operation. This isn't just a couple of interns in an office, right, putting out content on social media. This is packaged. This is branded. This is designed. There's Twitter and Facebook accounts that are associated with this. It is, in essence, a content marketing team that is producing high-level content meant to be reporting on the campaign from inside of it itself. Okay, and my last slide, let me just sort of point to the ways that the Trump campaign has really sort of, I think, in the long run, not only been unconventional with respect to a political campaign effort, but much more broadly, I think if my story is right, an infrastructure of politics over time gets built over time, this will hurt the Republican Party in the years to come. Right? So Trump has hired much fewer people onto his campaign organization. He hasn't built traditional campaign organizations whatsoever. In my home state of North Carolina, Hillary Clinton has about 31 different field offices around the state, around people using data, going door to door, knocking on doors, figuring out who their voters are, compared to at least as of 2 months ago, 0 for the Republican Party. I think that number's up to about 8 now, but there's a huge disparity between the two campaigns. But we see a couple things on Trump's bid, and this is just an article that I wrote for the Monkey Cage that sort of laid this out. But broadly, on the Trump campaign, there's a failure to invest in things like consultancies and talent. There's a failure to run field operations that will result in millions of data points gleaned on the electorate. So just think about all the people the Republican Party and the Trump campaign are not contacting and not asking for information about whether they're registered to vote and not asking about who their vote preference would be. So the party is going to lose historical data in the future. The Trump campaign hasn't invested the same degree in analytics and data models that future campaigns could use. So how are we going to model our voters to figure out who's persuadable and who's not? How are we going to model our voters to figure out who we're reaching? And at the end of the day, you're going to see far fewer firms launched after Trump's bid than on Clinton's bid that will institutionalize those technologies and carry them across election cycles and down ballot. So if I'm right, and I've been wrong so many times this election, so it comes with that caveat, if politics is built up over time and in part historical, you're going to see this democratic competitive electoral advantage in tech and in the sorts of practitioners who work in this field carry itself to election cycles in the future. All right, I will stop there and we can do a Q&A. Thank you.